Hi, my name is Pilgrim, and I'm attending the Spring Birds of a Feather with the father of Spring himself, Rod Johnson.
Message provided. So, like in case of a J2E case, you always have connection factory, and there's actually not that many GMS providers that actually ship resource adapters. There's just really two that I'm aware of. That's actually true. For some reason, they ship the resource adapters right from the start. While most of the commercial ones, the enterprise integration brokers actually don't. Or, well, they might, but they don't mean it. I mean, it's sort of, we ship a resource adapter, but the documentation says don't use it unless you are forced to. So from Spring's perspective, just use whatever facility your message broker suggests. So if the documentation says this is the way how you typically set up this typical broker, and it's the tip GMS connection factory, then do it that way. Don't even bother with JCA setup. If you use ActiveMQ on the other hand, it might be quite an enabling choice, quite an enabler. If you go on the JCA rules, ActiveMQ can do some nice stuff based on the JCA setup. But it's really just follow whatever the broker says.
My point was that the underlying question was, is it really a big problem of using the following kind of behavior of the default message container versus using the actual inflow?
The actual inflow?
Like a GCN expert, so I usually see, at the end of the day, how much better.
I see what you mean. Of course, yeah, default message just the container does some polling. So it does some custom polling based on essentially message consumer receive loops.
Receive is just a wait call.
Yeah, it's a wait call. So even if it keeps a couple of threads active, keep in mind that almost all of them are spending the time waiting.
Spending a while.
And at the moment we have, of course, a thread that's suspended for waiting doesn't take any resources really.
Each of them has created a connection.
Yes, I mean that's
especially on an XA scenario.
There's a couple. Yeah, that's a good point. There's a couple of important considerations there. In an XA case, you need to make sure underlying connection factory is pooling, like a JDBC source, but it needs to pool connections, sessions, ideally even producers and consumers. The same problem is with JCA since it isn't necessarily doing anything different. I mean, it really depends on the provider, but a simple implementation of a JCA resource adapter, all it does, it goes down internally as a loop. So it sits on the side of but of course, what JCA does is it enables the provider to be smarter, to be more sophisticated. So the provider may reuse a single event notification mechanism that it uses, maybe a single receive loop, spawning messages into different listeners for different destinations, while default messages in the container has to have one receive loop per destination. So there's a couple of things the provider can do to optimize the process. So if a JCA resource adapter is available and recommended by your broker, like in an ActiveMQ's case, then use it. If you have, in particular, if you have a large number of listeners with a large number of destinations attached to them, that's where JCA really shines. If you have just like 1, 2, or 3 listeners with destinations, it doesn't make a difference. It won't make a difference.
So you wouldn't say that using that to default message container listener with XA is not like an entire pattern?
No. It's a bit of a subtle affair in terms of configuring it so that it really it's an optimal to actually reach an optimal configuration. But it's by no means net parallel. And in the JCA case, just remember that this only works if you have the embedded JCA provider and an embedded transaction manager. So you really need to stick those pieces of the puzzle together yourself. It works fine, but you need to be in control over the transaction coordinator and the broker setup, which you are only in a standalone environment. Okay. While in a J2E environment, well, you don't have access to the JCA connector. It's down there in the stack somewhere, but you don't see it and you don't get access to it. So all you get is this connection factory and this wrapper that the J2E server exposes to you. And you need to live with whatever the connection factory provides, because that's all you can do. And default messages in the containers essentially taking that position. I just have a connection factory. I'm trying to get the maximum out of this connection. Not for the application, but for the interaction between the application server and the connector.
Well, I guess that's the point that I'm making. Like, if you think about a world where you don't have to swallow the whole enchilada with Java EE, you know, is something that's primarily for app server vendors that interesting to you?
I wonder if actually what people like is the JMS. I wonder how many WebSphere clients actually use WebSphere JMS as opposed to MQ or TIBCO. I have never actually seen one.
That's a really interesting question. Like, I mean, I remember having a discussion with Jürgen in a pub in London when Jürgen pointed out something which is actually pretty obvious, but I never thought about before, which is that in many enterprise applications, the message bus is like the DBMS. It's an assumption. It's not part of the app server. Like, people are using JBoss or they're using WebLogic, and the chances are they're going to use TIBCO or WebSphere MQ. They're probably not going to use the messaging. Well, in fact, I mean, if you look at mission-critical messaging applications, WebSphere MQ and TIBCO are really quite dominant.
If you look at a bank, you know, MQ infrastructure is just a strategic bank-wide platform that has its own team to manage it, its own service center. It's not something they just bundle in the application.
Like a database system.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's something that we think of differently. Like, I don't know, WebSphere probably bundles Dove, and JBoss bundles something or other. HSQL. And like, just because JBoss bundles HSQL doesn't mean you use HSQL. And you know, in terms of large enterprise environments, people use absolutely as much JBoss MQ as they use HSQL. So the fact that it's bundled with the app server is not really relevant. That's an interesting one.
There's also this notion of deploying a message broker resource adapter into the application server, but even that is rare.
It's a nightmare.
Yeah, you had that experience.
Yeah.
I mean, in most cases, what people do is they have this external broker system running, and they essentially integrate with it. I mean, it's like setting up the driver, the JMS connection factory as driver, just talking to the system, just like if you had a database driver, just a messaging driver talking to the function. Which means that the application server itself isn't even participating in this. So it's just the application itself going directly to the broker, interacting with it, and the application server, well, it provides the runtime environment, but it isn't involved in the entire messaging interaction.
And in the mainframe integration space, rather than using like CCI or something, MQ, so many banks use MQ for mainframe to Java integration. You send a request to the mainframe application, it picks it up on MQ, it sends you a bunch of stuff back. They don't use fancy APIs, just not seen it, because they're slow and they're horrible. And a lot of these applications on the mainframe are written as old applications, so I don't know if many people are familiar with the mainframe, but they have the same problems of separating presentation from logic. And loads of applications are written.
Screen scraping
things. Yeah. And there are loads of solutions you can buy for this, but the best thing to do is if you've got control of the mainframe program, is to put another mainframe program in front of it. Because it's much easier to mess around with it then. And you can send an MQ message to it and send one back. And I've seen that so many times. It's very efficient.
I don't know why somehow I can never feel good about JCA. It just feels to me like an obfuscation API in search of a problem. I mean, obviously, we never have anything like that in Java EE.
Do you think that JCA should be replaced by web service if you can? I know of one bank that has done so. They replaced a call.
The CCI.
Instead of CCI.
CCI.
A lot of people do that. There's a product you can get for kits, which is called HostBridge, which basically does, it's a great solution. It's just a hack. And it basically gives you an XML representation of the 3270 terminal screen. Literally, like your day and beep and see. Great. But that allows you to interact with XML rather than via some hokey API. But I think the other side of JCA, which I think Rob's talking about specifically, is the connector part for external systems, replacing that with web services would be
Yeah. JCA is really multiple concerns baked into the same spec. The SPI and the CCI part are quite different. Even strange spec-wise. Yeah. For some reason, they bundle it into the same spec. It doesn't really have much to do with each other.
So what was the motivation for adding the JCA bootstraps contracts into .1?
You mean deploying
deploying
application context as a raw file?
Yeah.
Mainly the way that we've seen a couple of projects building WAR files. With the WAR files, just firing up a couple of scheduled jobs and listeners and not having any entry point. So there's no servlet in there. Just the context level listener, bootstrapping that part, talking to the application service, data source, connection factories, and transaction manager, but not doing any white interaction. And I mean, of course, this works, and we would kind of recommend this probably if somebody asked how you get to do this in the easiest way in your existing installation. Even it's not a bad way to achieve this, but it feels a bit off. Like, is this a web application? Why do you define a web XML with no entry point? Just as a way to bootstrap this group context. And the RAR file is essentially just a sort of trimmed down version of this. So you package a RAR file, there is no servlet there is no servlet API here, and you just bundle this root application context, you can do anything you want with it, and it's a simpler form, a purer form of deployment for that kind of...
It's interesting as well, actually, that says the profile notion, which is, if I were a vendor, I could potentially think about selling my different packages of my technology, and maybe I want to sell a headless version of my application server. If you think about why people buy J2EE servers, they don't buy it for the program model, they buy it for the transaction management, for the security. In fact, they buy it for operations more than anything else. The operations team have way more say into what application servers get bought than the development team. You could think about them saying, well, here's a version of my application server that has no web container, in which case the RAR file deployment becomes extremely important because you've got no other way to deploy to it.
If they remove the web container from the installation.
And you can think about removing the size of the thread calls and the amount of memory used, it would be quite efficient.
So then you lose like the aspect, because I do have those kind of needs to deploy like very webless wars very quickly. And like the only nice thing about it is that you can still move like to here if you want to share resources and kind of do some kind of digging, decoupling. But then that's
You can also
lost
use the raw file
with the raw, right? You cannot share anything. You cannot like. You just have to wait for OSGi to have the real standalone business deployment unit.
Like you said, I put the raw file in here.
Yeah.
Just like you put a raw file in here.
Just the web applications wouldn't really have that class of apparently. On the other hand, that's pretty service specific on what the raw class actually looks like. So yeah, it's like when JAVAWUG just a unified class, so it doesn't make
Yeah, we
difference.
just let it work out.
Yeah. So JAVAWUG is one of those platforms where raw files actually pretty common. So just anything and everything is a raw file. There's one specific feature that's maybe worth mentioning here, that a raw file has, a resource adapter has, that the web application does not have, which is in the Bootstrap context, there is a work manager. It's not the common J work manager, it's the JCA work manager. But this is available to a resource adapter, just through the Bootstrap context for that the resource adapter receives. And in our raw support, we are using that automatically as a task executor. So if you do some task execution stuff, then it's automatically using this JCA work manager, which means if you're doing scheduling and GMS message listening, you're using this application server provided work manager, which is intended for that very purpose. That's why they put it in this. A connector needs to be able to spawn off some work needs. So there's a pretty natural way of integrating with the service scheduling, the service thread pooling, which a web application doesn't really have officially in J2EE. Of course, you can use the common J work manager on WebLogic and WebSphere, but there is no standard J2EE API. So in some service, the only way to get access to the service thread pooling is in a JCA resource adapter. You could also compose a system where the system consists of a couple of deployment units. Like maybe you have a web application, But a separate part of your system is bundled as a RAR file. We just package that in one here. So, which with the user interface sitting in the WAR file currently, and of course, and the scheduled cleanup, polling, file system, whatever jobs sitting in the RAR deployment unit and interacting with each other, living next to each other.
Talking about the deployment of RAR files and one of the deployment issues, I think one of them
units. There are certainly in some of the specific specs, like the servlet spec, one of the focuses is addressing web.xml, and the idea of the servlet container having possibly some plug-in API that something like, say, Struts or Spring MVC or Webflow or something can implement that says to the service, the servlet container, hey, it's me, I'm Struts, you don't need all this completely redundant boilerplate in web.xml. But with respect to the fundamental deployment units, there doesn't seem to be any intention to address that. And I mean, frankly, I think in a world of OSGi, if OSGi achieves its full potential, it makes you realise the god-awfulness of the wars and RARs and ears and the whole J2EE deployment.
And because in the current scheme, there's no way of replace things in production or manage versions of any
J2EE deployment is highly redundant and brain dead, basically. And I don't know, it would be good, obviously, if it was addressed in EE6. But, I mean, the biggest single issue in terms of thinking about my experience of this in running teams is the productivity loss due to class loading. And any real-world application is non-portable because of the, if you've got, say, in a traditional model, you've got 4 EGB jars, you've got 3 wars, you've got a couple of RARs. I mean, absolutely forget porting that to any other app service. This isn't going to work.
Not without modifications.
Yeah.
If you just pick like a WAR file on its own, that actually works quite okay. But once you start entering the ear,
well, I mean, if you use a WAR file and then you use Spring, obviously it'll work fine. But
with a plain WAR file, the web containers did quite a bit of effort in allowing for hot redeployment. So it works to some degree. But in the
still the issues of
no
the
chance.
inversion of the way in which the servlet spec talks about potential inversion of class loading order, which breaks the fundamental class loader architecture. Yeah. That's kind of interesting.
But there is no possibility, it was not talked about, to have a class loading scheme for the ER.
It is not in the present EE6 proposal, but it's something that we will undoubtedly be raising on the expert group. Whether or not it's something they take action on, I don't know, but it's definitely something that we will be suggesting on the expert group that needs to be discussed.
Can I just ask, how would a headless application server work? Because the first thing you go is through the console. So if it has no web container, how would you manage it? Because it
command line.
Okay. Dumb question.
Coming back to deploying application context within a RAR file, so that could then be used to do initialization on startup of the container instead of the WAR approach. I think sometimes which is often need to do something up front, and usually I use the WAR file.
Yeah, I mean, in the resource that we have at least a defined lifecycle, which whenever the thing starts up, you have a start and stop method.
It's
EGB.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is now
5 releases of the EGB spec.
I think it's even better than with the WAR file, since the WAR file, I think there's no guarantee when everything starts up. So
there is, it's just kind of not correctly implemented by some containers.
But if it's in a RAR file, it should be launched before EJB.
Yes.
Oh, I see what you mean, relative to other,
Within a year, the wars get started after the EGB change. Yeah, indeed. Indeed, that's a good point, the RARs definitely started first.
Yeah.
Deployment model for Java Enterprise applications, and what sort of sense do you get of the application server vendors being prepared to themselves kind of jump on the OSGi bandwagon, if you like?
Well, I mean, if you look at the JAVAWUG vendors, they're heavily on the bandwagon.
So WebSphere 6 is actually built on OSGi. BEA are then microservices architecture that they're based on. That's now on the OSGi platform. Oracle are heavily involved in the SpringOSGi project because they're building on the OSGi platform.
So they internally are building their own application servers.
So right now they're building their application servers on OSGi, and then I absolutely think, yes, if it works out the way we hope it does, OSGi will replace the deployment model and the units. It's not going to eliminate the need for something that has application server style services, the transaction manager, all that stuff has to come from somewhere. But the deployment model, yes, and I think that hopefully that will be your application packaging operational runtime model. Whether the application server itself is actually on OSGi or not, it's kind of in some senses immaterial to you. Because you just see it sitting in there, so they give you an OSGi container, but it's interesting if it is in the sense that you can actually get very flat, so you can have your application almost as a peer with the services offered by the application server, and it just becomes like a flatter environment with some services provided out of the box by the app server, some from your application. You just have what you need. So we open up a whole bunch of interesting opportunities. So it could change the shape of things, but when you've got big vendors that have been doing things in a certain shape for a long number of years, it might take some time.
I think it's sooner or later something will break up the market. I mean, like, you know, how many people are so satisfied with WARSIs and RARs that they wouldn't consider an alternative? Put your hand up if you wouldn't consider an alternative. So, you know, given that there's a lot of interest in the vendor space, somebody presumably is going to offer something like that, and everyone else is going to be forced to follow.
Oh, but some extent it's already happening with your logic event server.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just not an application server, but it does offer certain services.
Yeah, I think that's
it does
really
integrate with all these basic communication mechanisms.
Yeah, and I think that's a real indication of where BEA are going. I mean, BEA view themselves as a provider of service. If you think, I mean, BEA see themselves as a company that has a high quality server product. They don't actually view the particular APIs and deployment model that that server offers as being as critical as the quality of service, etc. So I don't think, you know, most of the app service vendors are not actually that precious about the particular deployment model you use. I mean, if you as their customers say you want something, they'll probably consider that.
They're not selling the deployment model, are they? The customers are not buying the deployment model. They're selling the services, the middleware, and the customers are buying the middleware.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a natural progression. So, for example, given that JBoss effectively commoditized the deployment model, it's quite natural for, say, BEA to look towards ways that they can, you know, pull on what they perceive to be their strengths.
It should make it easier for people to use their value-added services. I think they're good at transaction management, server container. They don't care how you build your applications as long as you build it on their middleware.
Plus that in the OSGi deployment model, you can see a lot more value for more management tooling and stuff like that. A lot more than the current deployment model offers.
Yeah,
So in that sense, it's actually added value services.
Services, the wiring, I mean, the runtime introspection thing, it's all there in OSGi.
And so added value services are actually becoming much more interesting for vendors to start building again.
I think it's an interesting thought exercise in that J2EE has made us intellectually lazy. I mean, I'm hardly the leading cheerleader for J2EE, and yet when I started thinking about OSGi, I kind of realized these assumptions that I'd had for years of, well, like it must be this way, it must be this kind of coarse-grained thing. And suddenly you start to think in a really different way, where you realize that, well, I could redeploy just that part of the application, or I could update it and keep deployed what I had in the previous version. I think it's, yeah, the benefits are just so compelling that it's inevitable.
Do you think it's mature enough for us to still room to extend the specification. But I found like
OSGi itself, or
yeah, there was OSGi specification. Like for example, if you want to deploy Hibernate, just like
so OSGi, the core containers are actually pretty mature and stable. But OSGi, I mean, as I said, so OSGi used for enterprise applications, that's a new direction for OSGi. That is currently the bleeding edge, and there is bleeding going on. Particularly taking established enterprise libraries that make certain assumptions about what the context class loader can see, etc. That OSGi just breaks. And we're trying to figure out how to repair those and get the right environment, etc. That's what a lot of the work of the enterprise
Hey.
What's up, dude? What's up, man?
What's up?
TV?
Yeah.
What's up, dude?
What's up, dude?
You're gonna be on TV?
No.
No?
I don't run a TV station.
Oh yeah, man, stick it on YouTube.
Yeah, I could do that.
SpringOne.
SpringOne, yeah. This is Lattice. This is BEA. WebLogic Server 7. 10.
Sorry? Yeah, that would be
Okay. This is the end of the day. Stand here. This is very late in the day. Just to give you a feel.